accusing that officer of that. But that is a perception.
And I understand that can be the perception.
You're familiar with the case in Cleveland? Cop stood on the hood of a car, pumped 15 shots out of his revolver into the windshield, and killed 2 innocent, unarmed people, said he never feared more for his life.
I'm not familiar with
Do
these.
you have an idea of the distance between the officer and the 2 young men at the time of the shooting?
I do not.
Okay.
Mr. Suhan, can you explain the process once the investigation is complete? How do we determine if this was justified?
Yes, thank you. My name is John Toon. I'm the prosecuting attorney here in Thurston County, and I appreciate the question. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of my office in the investigation, and then as the matter progresses forward. This morning, my office was advised about the incident and the fact that the critical incident team have been called out and deployed. I have a deputy prosecutor that is assigned to be a liaison to that team, who was consulted and advised briefly about what was going on with the incident. I will tell you right now that I won't be able to answer any questions regarding the facts of the incident because I have basically no more information, factual information at this point than you've heard so far. But we do make ourselves available through this liaison to answer questions for investigating officers if they have legal questions that come up during the process of the investigation or need to consult in some way or another with my office. Now, as the investigation progresses forward, eventually that will be submitted to our office for a review, and that is the role of the prosecuting attorney, is to review the investigative facts, make a determination as to whether any charges should be brought in the case, and if so, what charges should be brought, and to proceed forward if in fact charges are appropriate. To do that, we wait until the investigation is complete, so we really don't start our review until the investigation is completed, and then we've received all of the reports and the available evidence. And even then, we may ask for additional follow-up work to be done if we have questions that seem to be unanswered from the reports. It is basically our review in terms of the officer's involvement of this to determine if the force used in this instance was reasonable. And that is a partially a legal review and partially a factual review. And so in doing that, we look at not just the officer's statement we also look at statements of all of the other witnesses that are interviewed along with the physical evidence, compare all of those things to make determinations about what our impression is as to what the facts are, and then look at the reasonableness of that given our role in presenting cases to juries around that question. I will tell you that in Washington, the standard for the prosecution of a law enforcement officer in using deadly force in the line of duty is fairly high. By law, an officer in this state cannot be prosecuted for use of deadly force if they acted in, quote, good faith and without malice, unquote. And so that is a legal standard that we will be looking at as we review all of the information once that comes to our office for review. So that's the process, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that.
Do your office routinely work with the agencies of this task force? Is that correct? Like the Olympia Sheriff's Office?
We review referrals to us for criminal cases.
But
from law
your office
enforcement
works
agencies.
with detectives and police officers routinely from those agencies.
We're often consulted in cases, yes.
And you prosecute cases that they bring to you, and you need them in order to prosecute those cases. Isn't that correct? Doesn't that create
yes.
a conflict of interest for the prosecutor? And would you consider a grand jury or asking to impale a special grand jury to review these kinds of shootings?
Washington grand juries aren't used to do legal review of these kinds of cases. There may be legal tools at use, but the reality is we look at cases like this every day, and the fact that it's an officer that's involved is not, I don't think, a conflict for us in the sense that we can evaluate a case on its facts whether it involves an officer or not. In fact, we do get cases from time to time where officers are alleged to have committed criminal violations, and in some instances, if we feel that's warranted, we do file charges. And that is really the role of the prosecuting attorney, and frankly, one of the reasons the prosecuting attorney is an independently elected official.
Have you ever prosecuted an officer for shooting somebody?
I personally have not prosecuted an officer for use of force in terms of gunshot. I have prosecuted officers for other kinds of incidents.
Are the standards higher or lower or the same for Thurston County as for the state of Washington? And how about Olympia as compared to the state of Washington?
The standard that we use is prescribed in state law, if that's what you're asking. And so our guidelines are to look at the statute. As I indicated, there's a specific statute that talks about when police officers are authorized to use deadly force in this state. And the standard is that they are allowed to use deadly force when it is reasonable and necessary in furtherance of their duty and when they act in good faith and without malice.
And that same thing holds true across the state.
That is a state statute that is across the state, yes.
Thank you.
How much more difficult is it for you to prosecute a case with no video evidence? We don't have anything at this point, it sounds like.
Well, the reality is we rarely have video evidence in most of the cases that we prosecute. And so you just evaluate what you get. And that's generally a combination of lots of different kinds of evidence, including eyewitness testimony, other physical evidence. And so sometimes video can be helpful, sometimes it cannot. It's not helpful, and it varies from case to case. So I wouldn't say that it's in any way an inhibitor for us to review the case. But I will say that we look at all of the evidence and compare it all together in terms of making our decision.
Can you just clarify on the law? You mentioned reasonable and necessary, and then you said good faith and without malice. Is that a two-part test? How does that work?
The statute is written in a way that it talks about the use of force being reasonable and necessary with in several different circumstances. One is to effect an arrest of somebody who has committed or is committing a felony. The statute goes on to say that an officer who acts cannot be charged criminally if they act in good faith and without malice. So in some ways, it is both. Both statutes do govern, and we will have to look at both prongs of that statute when we review the case.
I guess the question would be, let's say, just theoretically, an officer fired because he or she was scared, and that didn't meet the reasonable and necessary test, but it also didn't run afoul of the without malice test. You know, I got scared, I fired, but I shouldn't have done that. How would your office view that?
What we would look at, again, is what's the specific evidence that gives us that inference that the officer was in fact in fear or not in fear? Because the reality is we're kind of looking at fear, the absence of fear, and or bad faith or malice, all kind of in the same question. If we were to determine, and I'm not going to go too far down the hypothetical road, but if we were to determine that in fact an officer's use of force may have been not met a reasonableness standard, but the evidence suggested that in fact the officer was acting in good faith and without malice, the statute would prohibit us from filing a criminal charge. That does not apply to other kinds of legal actions or administrative reviews by the department.
Since most officers say they're always in fear of their life when they go out, how is it possible that you could ever not prosecute somebody, or prosecute somebody, if they're going to always say, no matter what happened, I was fearful, my life was in danger?
Officers, an officer's statement is only one piece of the overall evidence that will be gathered. Now, you've heard the extent of the investigation that's going on and the amount of resources that are going into this investigation. I have every confidence that this is going to be an extremely thorough investigation, that there will be literally hundreds of details brought out to be looked at. The officer statement is really going to be only one piece of that. And as I said, when we look at the case, we're going to look at the whole of the case, the officer statement, but also the other evidence that's available, and make a decision based on the totality of the evidence.
Thank you.
There's a question.
Yeah,
over here.
we put our police officers in harm's way often. And we hold them to higher standards. In my case, I'm the father of black boys and black girls, and there are other people of equal concern. And my sense is that how can you make a decision, and I'm going to credit this to Channel 5, there is no indication to me that race was a factor in this case. Race can be a visible factor based on my mind and the inquisitiveness and sometimes the fear that I may hold for an African American because of my upbringing or because of my background. How can you make that decision so fast as chief that race was not a factor? Is that just because nothing racial was uttered? That seems to be early to make that decision. You haven't talked to the officer. You have eons of questions that haven't been answered. You have a public out there that's, in my case, in a country where 5,000 African Americans were lynched without a trial, and only 5 whites have been lynched in the executed for killing blacks as we speak today.
Come on.
And we know in cases such as all American cities, all of this doesn't relate to the Olympia Police Department. I'm making a pretext statement here of what you're dealing with to drive some of the concern among us out there who are concerned about the discord and the history of discord. And we know that that's been very deep when it comes to serving the African American community. We know that law enforcement has been a bit on the short side of using all of the tools in their bags when it comes to African Americans. They go from A to Z and use the weapon. Yes.
It sounds to me like your question is for the chief. Are you directing your
My
question
question,
to the chief?
my question is to the chief. How can you make a, my question is, and I have to say Channel 5 per this paper, I didn't hear the chief make this statement. There is no indication to me that race was a factor in this case at all. How can you make that decision so quickly?
Just so that we're clear on the context of the conversation, I was asked, I believe, related to whether race was an issue in this situation. And what I said was, I have no indication that that was. Whether that is or not, that will be determined by this investigation. But I have nothing that leads me to believe that it was a factor. Now, there may be something that could come up that may change that, but at the time I was asked during the press conference, there was nothing that I had or knew about that would be a determining factor for the actions of the officers at the time. That's the context of the conversation. So I want to thank you all for coming. Mr. Mayor, did you want to say any words?
Thanks, Chief. I'm Mayor Stephen Buxbaum, and I appreciate the questions. I want to reinforce my statements made earlier today. This morning's shooting was an unfortunate and tragic event. I am confident that our community will meet this challenge in a thoughtful, responsible, and meaningful way, and that includes answering and thinking about the very hard social questions that we have to address as a community and as a nation. We are committed to looking hard at what happened by investing in an investigation that focuses on the facts. As they emerge, we will ensure that our response will be responsible and just. Olympia values nonviolence. We are committed to a path that will yield the most in terms of justice, healing, and reconciliation. I encourage citizens to engage in thoughtful and reflective dialogue. This is a time for us to pull together. Participation in one or more of the several events that are and will be taking place across the community is a good thing and will speed us on our way to justice and healing. I am heartened and hopeful that both of the individuals that were involved in this morning's shootings will fully recover. In the meantime, I hope all citizens will join me in positive engagement that will yield the most in terms of social justice and reconciliation. Thank you very much.